Member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today to speak on the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Bill 2021 and accompanying bills. This bill will introduce a regulatory regime to enable construction, installation, commissioning, operation, maintenance and decommissioning of offshore electricity infrastructure. I would pause to note that in certain circumstances the Morrison government is happy to introduce regulation and legislation. It just likes to pick and choose which ones it does. The framework is long overdue. Energy developers have been waiting for the certainty this will provide. Subject to sensible amendments, this bill should be passed without delay. The purpose of the framework, and of course I support that there be a framework because it does the job that it needs to do in giving certainty. It is for the establishment of an offshore wind energy industry in Australia, but will also support projects like the Marinus Link and the Sun Cable project. Offshore wind energy, in particular, has remarkable potential to generate jobs, bolster and diversify energy supply, drive down electricity prices, improve grid reliability and lower greenhouse gas emissions. This would be a win-win-win. So whilst onshore wind now accounts for only 10% of Australia's power, to date we're lagging so far behind other nations in developing our offshore wind capacity. For example, in the United Kingdom, they've been developing their industry since 2007, and it already has over 10 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity installed. Prime Minister Johnson has put expanding the industry at the centre of his 10-point plan of a green industrial revolution. The UK is aiming for 40 gigawatts offshore by 2030. This year, Denmark greenlit the biggest offshore project in the world, which will be a €28 billion artificial energy island that will power 3 million homes. Now that is visionary and ambitious. Denmark currently generates a remarkable 40% of its electricity from wind power. Australia needs to catch up. Australia's wind resources are some of the best in the world. We have 60,000 kilometres of coastline and high capacity factors in excess of 80% in some areas. Much of these resources are situated close to existing transmission lines and port infrastructure, so there is an enormous potential to develop a substantial industry. Blue Economy has estimated Australia could support over 2,200 gigawatts capacity, which is more than our current energy demand and more than enough to make us a renewable energy superpower, which should be our aim. Traditionally, wind energy has been expensive, but that is changing with economies of scale, research and development and competitive tendering mechanisms. Offshore wind may cost less than onshore in the future. Developers see this opportunity. There are 12 offshore wind projects with a combined capacity of 25 gigawatts proposed in Australia already. Just one project off Gippsland, the Star of the South, could be worth $6 billion for their regional economy and could generate 3,000 jobs over its lifetime. This project would also support up to 20% of the state's energy needs, or the equivalent of 1.2 million homes. This is a huge benefit. The irony is that many critics, and I should note the Deputy Prime Minister's comments in question time some days ago, will say that we should have offshore wind off for Warringah. But the truth is these developments will provide communities with enormous potential for industrial development. We need to put the right technologies in the right places, where there is the need, the demand and the workforce. Beyond Zero Emissions analysis has found that developing offshore wind would revitalise industry in regional hubs. They projected that Newcastle, for example, could attract $28 billion in capital investment, $11 billion in revenue by 2032 and generate 34,000 jobs. Now surely that is the type of project that should be embraced, and not crazy projects like gas off the coast from Newcastle, like PEP 11. AEMO has indicated that other areas like northwest Tasmania, Gippsland, Illawarra have the same potential and could support many gigawatts of offshore wind energy each. Developing these resources is essential, as we will need to provide workers in those areas with real alternative employment in sectors other than fossil fuel mining and as mines and power plants retire. Blue economy projects that we could generate up to 8,000 jobs per annum from 2030 by developing our wind energy resources to the highest level. But more can and should be done to support the renewable energy sector so that we reach our climate goals. Climate Works in its landmark Decarbonisation Futures report has modelled that in a scenario where we would decrease emissions by up to 50% by 2030, and this is very real and very possible, and reach net zero by 2050, we will have to reach 75% renewables by 2030. And sadly, there was none of that detail in the government's plan slideshow that was announced yesterday. We can and should aim higher. We have the potential and we can exceed the targets. It will require policy support and shoring up investment confidence. The Clean Energy Council, in the Clean Energy Outlook Confidence Index, reported in July that investor confidence has decreased since December 2020. The report put this down to grid connection issues, underinvestment in network capacity and transmission, unhelpful and unpredictable government interventions, and future market design uncertainty. And sadly, none of this was addressed by the Morrison government yesterday. As a result, in August, the Clean Energy Council reported that there has been a loss of jobs in the sector due to a corresponding slowdown in financial commitments for renewable projects. This bill is a good development. It shows what a positive government intervention and support can be. But we must look to the government to act in so many other areas. The government, for example, should drop its misguided Kurri Kurri gas plant obsession. This is a $660 million mistake that won't support reliability or lower electricity prices. It will barely be used. It will spook investors and it should be scrapped. The government should also drop plans for their gas-fired recovery and focus on a clean recovery, with developing renewable energy capacity at the centre of any plan. The Energy Security Board has created considerable uncertainty with energy developers and investors in propagating the options of a post-2025 market design for the national electricity market. Of course, the federal government has endorsed this because it's ultimately a coal keeper. This is just a means and design to keep coal in the system. This policy could prolong the life of ageing coal-fired and gas-fired generators. We've heard in the Environment and Energy Committee inquiry into dispatchable generation, coal-fired generator owners like Delta Energy are very much expecting that that will be its use and that will be its purpose. The final design of the market must have at its centre a decarbonisation goal and cannot unnecessarily give thermal generators a new lease on life. We must understand who will bear the cost, what effect it will have on reliability and affordability. This will ultimately be a tax on the everyday energy user. We can't talk about energy without putting it in the context of our greater priorities and what we must do. We absolutely must address the environmental aspects and our need to decarbonise rapidly, but also in the context of these offshore wind projects. We need to make sure they have adequate environmental safeguards for any offshore development. As drafted, the bill requires a licence holder to submit a site management plan to NOPSEMA, but this will not necessarily address all environmental impacts. Instead, licensees just have to comply with the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act and regulations under that Act. We know that the APBC Act is incredibly limited in the sense that it won't encompass all potential marine impacts. Some matters are just not protected. There is no visibility on what those potential regulations are, and therefore does not appear to be any environmental assessment requirement. In contrast, in the United Kingdom, offshore projects are required to undergo a strategic environmental assessment detailing possible environmental impacts and remedies. This is a best practice and holistic way of addressing all impacts. Strategic environmental assessment should be triggered before declaring an area suitable for infrastructure. It would ensure only appropriate and low-impact areas are chosen and that decisions can be made before any investment, time-wise or financially, for a project proponent. Such regulations should be made under the EPBC Act and mandate proactive requirements of proposed offshore wind projects, including a strategic environmental assessment. There are serious uncertainties about how the EPBC Act would work for offshore and how it would interoperate with overlapping state laws. Guidelines should be made to clarify the interoperation of state legislation and the EPBC Act, but ultimately the federal government should have ultimate oversight. The bill allows for the minister to declare areas suitable for offshore infrastructure activities, but there are many concerns that have been raised about the lack of transparency and detail on what criteria are used to declare an area. There seems to be too much ministerial discretion. Before declaring an area, the minister should be compelled to consider commercial factors like promoting local industry, manufacturing and jobs. Additionally, the minister should consider wind resources, including geotechnical and bathymetric data, marginal loss factors and system strength augmentation. Port and grid infrastructure in the proximity of local manufacturing industrial precincts is also important. There should be incentives for development. As part of a good regulatory regime, there are annual licence costs, fees and levies in particular for cost recovery for administration and decommissioning of offshore infrastructure. These costs should be pared down to the minimum, particularly when the industry is in its early days. Decommissioning costs could be recovered with a ratcheting bond that increases over the life of the infrastructure. And levies should be designed to be no more burdensome than necessary to achieve cost recovery. They should not act as a disincentive to development. This bill is a landmark moment for development of Australia's own offshore infrastructure capacity and capability. It's been a long time coming, and we are far, far behind other nations. But with the right framework and incentives, we can support a significant offshore wind industry in Australia. I only wish that had been a core pillar of something announced by the government as far as taking a decarbonisation policy to COP26. There is so much potential and so much detail that could have been announced instead of just a slideshow and rehashing old policy. We actually need to embrace the technologies that are available now. It is not good enough to have a hope and a prayer that at some point in the future a magic and the fantasies and fairy tale unicorns will take care of continuing to use high emitting technologies. We must transition to these technologies we know are there now, are ready now, are delivering huge opportunities economically to other nations, and Australia could be in that position as well. So I support this bill, commend it to the House and urge the government to embrace further amendments.